Hey, thanks for coming out for Shadow Empire. What we're looking at is real history that completely altered the course of human history. So much so that you and I are still living with the consequences today. The life of Constantine shaped the way the Christian faith would unfold over the next 1700 years. Now, none of this came as a surprise to students of Bible prophecy. In fact, the prophetic books of the Bible, like Daniel or Revelation, they contain a detailed, unbroken history of the world written thousands of years in advance, and it's never been wrong, not even once. The details would blow your mind. They actually made a believer out of me. You would not believe what the Bible actually predicted ahead of time. That's why I'm really thankful that this church has invited you to be here. These people that you're with are really dedicated Bible students. They have some of the best material around for studying Bible prophecy and other major themes of Scripture. I think you'll be glad if you checked it out. You see, Shadow Empire is just scratching the surface. You wouldn't believe what else there is to discover. And now, today's presentation.
The world forever changed. His legacy, an empire reaching across centuries. His name, Constantine. Shadow Empire.
When you hear the word basilica, most people typically think of a church. And that's because for the last 1700 years or so, that's the way we've used the word. And not just any church is a basilica. It's got to be a church that has been granted special ceremonial rights or privileges by the Bishop of Rome. But a basilica was not originally a Christian building. In fact, a basilica wasn't even a religious building. It was a public court like this one, used by the pseudo-emperor Maxentius and then Constantine after the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Now, there used to be a massive statue of Constantine in this building, but time has taken its toll and that statue is now in pieces. You can go and see what's left of it over there up on the Capitoline Hill. This building was the place where Constantine did his official business. And just up the road behind me is another famous basilica, one of the most famous in the world. And that basilica represents the merging of two empires, the Kingdom of Heaven and another shadow empire that ran parallel beside it. This is the Basilica of St. John Lateran, one of the most famous churches in the world. Structurally, it resembles ancient Roman basilicas. You've got a big open space in the middle called the nave, and there are aisles running along the outside. When you look at the interior of St. John Lateran or other famous basilicas, and you go back and compare it to Roman basilicas, it becomes obvious that after Constantine, the Christian church was no longer a fringe group, an outside religion forced to survive in spite of the empire. Now, it was part of the empire. In fact, in Constantine's mind, Christianity would be the glue that held his new empire together. Now, remember, under Diocletian, the unity of the empire was all important. And Diocletian achieved stability by establishing a tetrarchy, 4 emperors who controlled the eastern and western halves of the territory. But Constantine changed all that. Not long after he defeated Maxentius, he also conquered the rest of the empire, which made him the only ruler. Rome was back to just one guy. But Constantine knew full well he was going to have to find some way to keep it all together, some way to achieve harmony. And that's where he saw value in the Christian religion. To his way of thinking, Christians were a perfectly unified people. He'd seen the way they stood together against Roman persecution, and it looked like they were so perfectly united, so perfectly in agreement that nothing would ever make them fall. Now that's what he wanted for his empire. He wanted to transplant the Christian dedication and unity he saw into his kingdom. Now, tradition tells us that Constantine underwent a radical conversion the day before he won the Battle of Milvian Bridge. But if that's true, if he really became a Christian that day, then he was remarkably silent about it. If he really did see a cross in the sky, if he really did hear a voice telling him, "Go conquer in this sign," then you'd expect those details to show up in the original telling of the story. But why didn't Constantine tell that story the day he marched into Rome? Why doesn't it show up anywhere on his arch? Why don't we have any record of it anywhere until 10 years later when he suddenly tells it to a church historian? And if Constantine really did convert to Christianity that day, if he really did submit himself to the Prince of Peace, then why did he go on killing his relatives, the ones he considered to be political threats? And why did he actually put off his own baptism until he was practically on his deathbed? There are just too many holes in the story, enough to make me personally doubt Constantine's conversion. What seems more likely is that Constantine embellished the story over time, and the Cairo symbol he painted on his men's shields slowly morphed into the vision story over the span of 10 years. Now, there is no doubt Constantine knew about the Christian God because he had believers in his family, his mother, his stepmother, and some of the other members of his household. And I have no doubt that Constantine respected the Christian God. But respecting God and submitting your life to Him are two different things. Here's what probably happened. Constantine gave credit to the Christian God for his victory, and he began to think that the Christian God was the best way to hold his kingdom together. The tenacity of Christians impressed him, and he thought people who would die for Jesus might also be willing to die for him. He thought Christians would be loyal to Rome if he could merge the empire and the church. So one of the first things Constantine did was give this palace, the Lateran Palace, to a guy by the name of Miltiades. He was the Bishop of Rome, and he really needed a place to live, because up to this point, the Bishop of Rome basically lived in a shack over on the other side of the Tiber River. Now, what we see here is not the original Lateran Palace. That one was damaged very badly during two fires in the 1300s. And then the Bishop of Rome eventually moved to his present location in the Vatican. Well, actually, he moved there after he returned from living in Avignon. Now, what was left of the original Lateran was ripped down in the late 1500s, and this one was built in its place. Today, it's home to the Vicar General of Rome, a representative of the Pope who handles all his business inside the city. But the reason this is a Christian building at all is because Constantine gave it to the church. Actually, some of Constantine's family lived here for a few weeks after his victory, and then he gave it to the bishop. It was a clear signal. Constantine had refused to thank Jupiter for his victory, and now he'd given the Christian bishop one of the most prestigious pieces of real estate in the entire city. And to top it off, he built a massive basilica, the original St. Peter's over on Vatican Mountain. Now, that's not the same St. Peter's that's there today. The present basilica is actually a replacement built on the same site in the 1500s, about the time that the Protestant Reformation was sweeping across Europe. Constantine actually built a slightly smaller St. Peter's, and if you climb down under the modern one, you can still see parts of Constantine's building. Christianity had now come to Rome for good. But then something else amazing happened. In the year 313, Constantine unwittingly fulfilled a prophecy from the book of Revelation. He traveled up to the city of Milan for a wedding, and while he was there, he did something that completely reversed Diocletian's policy of persecuting Christians. Remember, under Diocletian, Christians couldn't hold public office. They couldn't serve in the army, and eventually they couldn't even own churches or worship without losing their lives. But Constantine felt like the persecution was destabilizing the empire. It was making people distrust the Roman government. So he convinced other dignitaries that they should stop killing Christians. This all resulted in the Edict of Milan, a document which suddenly put an end to persecution and elevated the Christian faith to a position of prominence. Constantine returned the property that had been confiscated during the 10-year reign of terror. And if you found yourself in the unfortunate position of owning confiscated Christian property, you could actually ask Constantine's government for compensation. The church was no longer a fringe group. It was considered a legitimate corporation, a legitimate part of the Roman Empire. And most importantly, Constantine introduced the concept of full religious liberty. In the words of the Milan Edict, Constantine said, "We should give Christians and everyone else freedom to follow the religion each may want, so that whatever divinity may exist in the heavens will be willing to show benevolence to us and to all those who live under our authority." Now you'll notice Constantine's number one concern is still the unity of the empire, but it was a major leap forward for the Christians. They were now, at long last, legitimate, with the backing of the emperor himself. So, how does that fulfill Bible prophecy? Well, if you remember from a previous episode, when John wrote 7 letters to the 7 churches of Asia Minor in the book of Revelation, there was a direct reference to severe persecution in his letter to Smyrna. Now, Smyrna was the crushed or persecuted church. For centuries, sincere Bible students have recognized that those 7 letters predicted the entire span of Christian history, and the letter to Smyrna fits persecuted Christianity exactly. In Bible prophecy, a day is generally used to represent a year, so 10 days of persecution would actually be 10 years. The prophecy fits what Diocletian did to the Christians. It says in Revelation 2 verse 10, "Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life." The Diocletian persecution began with the Edict of 303, and it came to an abrupt end exactly 10 years later when Constantine issued the Edict of Milan. Now, that should be the end of the story, and from this point on, the church should have lived happily ever after because they were now the emperor's favorite. Nobody could touch them. Now, the Edict of Milan didn't establish Christianity as the official religion of the empire, but it did establish Christians as a real reason for religious liberty. And there was no question that Christians had suddenly moved from underdog to a position of privilege, a position they would hold for many centuries to come. But there was a big problem. It turns out that Christianity was nowhere near as unified as Constantine hoped. Within months of his victory, he made an unsettling discovery. And unfortunately, it's a discovery a lot of people still make when they get to know the Christian community. Christians can be anything but united. I mean, sure, on the big stuff they all get along, but on the day-to-day things, well, Christians are still human beings, imperfect sinners in need of a perfect God. And Christians know how to argue just like everybody else. Within months of Constantine's victory, a controversy erupted on the other side of the Mediterranean, over in Egypt. You see, during the Diocletian persecution, a lot of Christian leaders had caved in under pressure when the Romans came to confiscate their Christian books. They turned in their Bibles. They caved. They left the Christian church. And then when the persecution ended, they suddenly wanted back in because now it was easy to be a Christian. But as you can imagine, those who stayed the course, those who were in the church during all those dark years, were completely unimpressed. They called the people who had abandoned the church traditores. It's where we get the word traitor. And they didn't think those people should be allowed back in. And if they did come back in, they certainly couldn't hold church office. And if you've been baptized by a traditore, someone who left during the persecution, well, they considered your whole baptism completely invalid. The people who wanted to keep the traitors out of the church had a leader by the name of Donatus Magnus, and they were called Donatists. They wanted Donatus to become the Bishop of Carthage in North Africa, but there was a problem. There was already a Bishop of Carthage, a guy by the name of Cecilian, and he was in favor of bringing the traitors back into the church. So there was this really heated controversy right in the beginning of Constantine's reign. And when Christians couldn't settle the matter themselves, they made a direct appeal to the emperor. They wanted the state's help to resolve a dispute. That represented a radical change in the way that Christians handled their internal disputes. Centuries earlier, the Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthian Christians telling them not to drag their disagreements into public court. Dare any of you, he wrote, having a matter against another, go to law before the unrighteous and not before the saints? Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world will be judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? According to Paul, Christians served a king whose kingdom was not of this world. And because of that, worldly courts had no place in the church. Now you'll notice the Bible still anticipates that Christians would have disputes because they are, after all, human beings. But the place for arbitration is the church, not the courthouse. But under Constantine, that all changed. The Donatists, no longer fearing any kind of persecution, thought it would be a good idea to let the state decide their case. So Constantine asked the Bishop of Rome to preside over a panel that would make a decision one way or another. Should traditores be readmitted to the church? Should they be allowed to hold office and perform the rites and rituals of Christianity? Well, that panel decided against the Donatists, and the Donatists were furious, so they appealed the case, saying their side had not been given a full hearing. They said the Bishop of Rome had stacked the meeting against them. So Constantine ordered another meeting in another city in 314 AD. This time he called bishops from all over the empire to come and decide the matter. And once again they ruled against the Donatists. And once again, the Donatists were not happy. It was becoming obvious to Constantine that the glue for his new empire, the Christian church, might not be as strong as he thought. At one point, he got really irritated, and he wrote this letter. So great a madness persists, and he's speaking to the Donatists, that with incredible arrogance they repudiate the equitable judgment that has been given, so that by the will of heaven I have learned that they demand my own judgment. They demand my judgment when I myself await the judgment of Christ. Constantine believed that if he could not bring unity to the Christian church, God would stop favoring him, and he would never be able to unite the whole empire. So he got angry. He told the African church if they didn't get their act together, he was coming down in person to show them how to run a church. And if anybody didn't like that, well, to quote Constantine, "These without doubt I shall cause to suffer the due penalties of their madness and their reckless obstinacy." Basically what happened is that Constantine resorted to the one thing he knew as a Roman soldier. He resorted to force. He began mixing church and state in a way that had never happened in the first 300 years of Christianity. He blended the interests of the empire with the life of the church, and he even threatened the death penalty for people who didn't toe the line. Some historical records even indicate that Cecilian, the bishop who won the Donatist dispute, actually rounded up his opponents with the help of the Roman authorities and had them put to death. The Roman emperor had now become the de facto head of the Christian church. That became even more obvious in the next dispute that erupted in the brave new world of state-sponsored Christianity. A priest by the name of Arius, also from North Africa, began to question the divinity of Christ, and that created a massive uproar. This wasn't a matter of church politics like the Donatist controversy. This was doctrinal. It touched on a key teaching of the Christian faith: Jesus, the God-man, the second person of the Godhead, God in human flesh. Now, without getting into the technical details, the heretic priest Arius was teaching that Jesus was not equal to the Father, that he held a lesser position. Arius was teaching that Jesus proceeded from the Father at some point way back in ancient history, that he had been created. That, of course, was a big no-no in the Christian church. You do not mess with the divinity of Christ. Now, to solve the dispute, Constantine called a meeting in the ancient city of Antioch, which was one of the key centers of Christianity. And the reason Constantine called that meeting was because he now considered himself the head of the church. He, of course, himself had not been baptized, but he was still running the show. He sent his mother's pastor to mediate the dispute, not because he cared so much about the divinity of Christ, but because, once again, he was worried about keeping the empire together. If the Christians split up, he would lose the all-important glue for his kingdom. The meeting in Antioch was a bust. So Constantine called another one of the most famous church councils in Christian history, and he called it in what today is the city of Iznik, but back then was known as Nicaea. Delegates from all over the empire went to Nicaea, and history tells us that every single one of them actually had scars from the 10-year persecution. Some were blind, some were missing their limbs, some had burns all over their bodies. Every one of them had survived Diocletian's 10 years of terror. At the Council of Nicaea, the delegates confirmed what Christians had always believed: Jesus was fully God, co-eternal with the Father. Now, today, knowing that Constantine had become the de facto head of the church, some people have started telling a different story. Some people you'll hear say Constantine invented the divinity of Christ and he used the Council of Nicaea to do it. It's a popular theory with lots of modern skeptics who say that for the first 300 years of Christianity, Jesus was never considered anything but a mere man. But honestly, how do I put this? It's nonsense, historically speaking. That is not what happened here in the city of Nicaea. Go back through the writings of the Roman pagans in the first years of the Christian church, and one of the key objections the pagan philosophers had to the Christian faith was the fact that they were actually worshiping Jesus. In 170 AD, 150 years before Nicaea, the Roman critic Celsus mocked the Christian teaching of the Incarnation. He said, a perfect God would never become a human being. So it wasn't the Christians who questioned the divinity of Christ, it was the Romans. And while the Council of Nicaea absolutely did affirm Jesus' divinity, it didn't invent it, and neither did Constantine. The other thing that some people say happened here in Nicaea is that the council essentially invented our New Testament. Now, I've heard that a lot in recent years. You'll have people arguing that before 325 AD, there may be hundreds of books that Christians were considering sacred, and maybe dozens and dozens of Gospels. But here in Nicaea, they say Constantine only allowed the books and the Gospels into the New Testament that agreed with his ideas, and he rejected the books that didn't teach the divinity of Christ. Now, again, it's more historical nonsense. The early church fathers made clear reference to the books of the New Testament already back in the 2nd century, 100 years before the council met here in Nicaea. In the year 180, for example, an early church father by the name of Irenaeus referred to 4 Gospels. And he argued 4 is the perfect number for how many Gospels there would be. You'd expect God to choose that many. Now, if Constantine picked our 4 Gospels and put them in the New Testament, how in the world did Irenaeus know 150 years before that how many there would be? The truth is that the New Testament was already very well established by the time we had the Council of Nicaea, and Christ's divinity was well understood the very day the Christian church started. That was something Jesus taught to his disciples. As much as the critics want the Christian church to be an invention of Constantine, it's just not true. The church was established long before he was even born. But of course, that doesn't mean that Constantine didn't change something. At the Council of Nicaea, he underscored the emperor's new role as the head of the church. He actually came in person and presided over a lot of the discussions. And it's at this point in history that the state takes charge of determining what is orthodox belief. It started deciding cases for the church. Now, fortunately, the state mostly came to the right decision on that occasion regarding the teachings. But they had the wrong person presiding. It should not have been a Roman emperor. In the New Testament, Paul writes that the Scriptures are the standard of truth, not the emperor or his state-appointed councils. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God, he wrote to Timothy, and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, thoroughly equipped for every good work. The Christians had everything they needed to run the church and make decisions about what they would and would not believe, because they had the Bible. They didn't need the empire to run the church. Jesus was clear, my kingdom is not of this world. But starting in the 4th century, when the favor of the emperor suddenly fell on the church, our Christian ancestors launched something of a shadow empire. It looked like Christianity, it sounded like Christianity, but it had some problems. The life of the church was now about the Roman Empire and not really about the Gospel Commission. Over the years, it became more about Rome's European successors than the coming kingdom of Christ. We stopped preaching the words of Jesus, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's and unto God the things that are God's. Instead, what we did is we started blending the things of God with the things of Caesar, and history has proven that was not a healthy development. The state tragically started using force to run the church, to the point where Constantine even passed one of the very first blue laws, a law forbidding work on Sunday in the city of Rome. What was really strange about that is that most Christians weren't even observing Sunday in the early 4th century, but the first day of the week was sacred to the Romans, and it was a key part of Roman life, so it became part of the church, not through the Bible, but through the emperor. Constantine gave us the marriage of church and state, a marriage that continued well into the history of medieval Europe. He created an environment where eventually it was not just the state running the church, it was also the church running the state. It was a shadow empire, not the kingdom that Jesus intended, but a shadowy substitute. And it was not good for Christianity. I mean, sure, in the very early years under Constantine, just getting rid of persecution brought a lot of relief, and freedom was a breath of fresh air. But honestly, we really lost something when our faith became easy. Once we blurred the line between Caesar and Christ, between church and state, Christians became a tool of the state, and the state became a tool of the church. The Roman basilica became a Christian basilica, And eventually, when the Roman emperors all moved east to Constantinople, the church actually became the de facto Caesar in the West. If you were paying attention in high school history class, you know exactly what happened next. Suddenly, it wasn't Diocletian persecuting Christians for their beliefs. Christians actually started persecuting each other. We started running the church like the Romans ran their empire. If someone didn't toe the line, we brought them to a torture chamber, or maybe even tied them to a stake and burned them. Now, let me ask you, where did we get those kinds of ideas? You can search a Bible from cover to cover, and you will not find Jesus telling anybody to burn the heretics. That was a tactic we learned from the Romans. And today, the world looks on Christians with a great deal of skepticism. And to be honest, we've kind of earned it. For hundreds of years, we lived in the shadow empire of Constantine instead of the biblical kingdom of Christ. We started to build a so-called kingdom of God on earth using human government, but the Bible teaches that human governments are standing in the way of God's will on earth. Ancient biblical prophets like Daniel actually predicted the development of human kingdoms hundreds of years in advance. He managed to predict the empires of Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. He even named names long before any of it existed. But Daniel's point was essentially this: all those kingdoms would pass away the day Messiah came back and set up his own everlasting empire. Now, today you and I are lucky enough to live in the freest society in the history of the whole world. We have what the early Christians really never had. In the words of Thomas Jefferson, we have a wall of separation between church and state. And that wall gives us the freedom to worship as we please, to live freely as the followers of Christ. But in the 1980s, in the face of rapid moral decay in North America, we started to question that all-important wall. We started to say that maybe some atheists, maybe even the Soviet Union, came up with the idea of separation of church and state to undermine the Christian faith. We started to think that maybe the best way to secure our future was to win with Christianity at the ballot box, to just take over the reins of government and make Christianity the official state religion. At this juncture in history, it's very important that we realize what happens when Christians build a shadow empire. When we recreate Christianity in the image of Rome, we end up with something that kind of looks like Christianity. It has all the same trappings, all the same language, but it has a completely different objective. It no longer represents the humble teachings of the carpenter from Nazareth. And that means that you and I have a decision we have to make. Will it be Caesar or Jesus? By all means, live in this world. Be an active part of the community. Obey the powers that be. Be a good citizen. All of that is your God-given biblical duty. But at the same time, you have to know who the real king is and never lose sight of the real kingdom. And when there is a discrepancy between Caesar and the King of Kings, there is no choice for the Christian but to cast his lot with Jesus.
There's almost no overestimating just how profound Constantine's influence on Christianity has been. To this day, 1700 years later, he's still a household name. Almost everyone knows that he left his fingerprints on the church. The question in recent years, though, is which fingerprints are really his? Today, people say that Constantine basically invented the New Testament, that he told the bishops which books went into the Bible and which ones were rejected. But of course, we just saw that isn't true. The New Testament was well established long before the emperor was even born. And some say that Constantine invented the divinity of Christ, that no one actually worshiped Jesus before the Council of Nicaea. Now, of course, that isn't true either. And we know that because Roman critics, long before Constantine, mocked the Christians for deifying Jesus. So, no, the Christian faith is not a Constantinian invention. But still, we all have this sense that something changed. And here's what it was. Before Constantine, the church handled its own affairs. But when the Christian realized that the emperor was friendly, they started appealing to the state to solve their problems. That led to a situation that still exists in one form or another to this day, the uncomfortable mix of church and state. And of course, there's no reason that Christians can't be involved in the state. Most people would want to live in a nation influenced by the teachings of Jesus. But over the last 1700 years, we have lots of reasons to rethink the idea that the state should run the church or vice versa. Now it's time again to pull out your study guides. We're on number 4 now, and we're going to dig just a little bit deeper as we explore what the Bible says about Caesar and Christ.
Okay, so if you have your Bible studies on hand, grab those out. If you didn't get one, please raise your hand and Billy will come around and give you a Bible study. Anybody not get a Bible study for the last session? Put your hand up and we'll get a Bible study to you at this time. All right, it looks like everybody got theirs then. Well then why don't we go ahead and get started here. So in Pastor Boonstra's final presentation, we saw how Christians eventually begged the Roman emperor to get involved in church business. But the question that we're really pondering now is, was that a good idea to mix church and state in such a way? Well, let's get into the lesson. This one's called Constantine's Christianity, and we're going to study this out a little bit more, starting in question 1. So, as a precursor to asking the question, Constantine was surprised. Far from being the unified church that he thought it was, that Christianity had problems, and that they were people that argued and had internal conflicts. And in these big conflicts, they wanted him to come and settle it for them. Of course, as a Roman emperor, he only had a few tools in his bag, and the ones that he knew how to use best were force, right? So, question 1 says, what does the Bible suggest about turning to a secular authority to resolve church disputes? So, to study this, we'll turn to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 1 through 6. It says, dare any of you, having a matter against another, go to law before the unrighteous, and not before saints? Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world will be judged by you, are you unworthy to judge in the smallest matters? Do you not know that we shall judge angels? How much more the things that pertain to this life? If then you have judgments concerning things pertaining to this life, do you appoint those who are least esteemed by the church to judge? I say this to your shame. Is it so that there is not a wise man among you, not even one who will be able to judge between his brethren? But brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers. So here, in this passage, Paul is condemning, or at least judging, the Christians for doing what? Going to the judge. We call that nowadays suing one another, right? And in our country, where people seem to be quite sue-happy, that seems to be kind of just a commonplace situation. That if you don't like if somebody's done something to wrong you, first resort is to turn to the courts, right? The judge, on supposedly impartial judge, in town. And Paul's saying, look, if Christians have problems with Christians, you guys should be able to work that out among yourselves. So in this now, we're kind of hinting at a bigger question. What does that suggest about turning to secular authorities to resolve our problems? What is it really going to do? Sorry? That's what the church is still doing today? Yeah, it's true that in many times it is doing that. So Paul's basically saying, if you guys have internal conflict, handle it on your own. Don't go to people who don't even believe in God to resolve conflict, because that's not what they're most gifted at doing. Oftentimes, the true followers of Christ should be very gifted in interpersonal conflict. Now, sad to say, that is not always true among us. And maybe it's because we're unpracticed, because we give it to professionals, right? I think it's something we need to really consider more. Let's go on to one more verse here to kind of support that first question. Let's go on to read Mark chapter 12, verse 17. It says, "And Jesus answered and said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." Now, embedded in this statement from Christ, what advice is he really giving here? Okay. Exactly. That's really what he's getting at here. It's not just a question of whether somebody should pay taxes or not. It's a question of, did you have a thought, Shante? Yes, to repeat what Kenneth said, keep the things that are of the church in the church, and keep the things that are for the world in worldly situations or context. And so that's really what Jesus is getting at here. It's not just a question of whether to pay taxes or not. He's actually saying keep the things in the sphere which they belong. So let's go on to question number 2. So in that last text that I just read, there's kind of more context to it, and I think we need to go into more detail about what was actually going on here to understand the appropriate boundaries. In that text from Mark, where Jesus is being asked a question, what was really going on? What's the really story behind it? When we read the whole story, what else can we learn? So let's read the whole story. Mark chapter 12, verse 13 through 17, it says, "Then they sent to him some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to catch him in his words." So what was the purpose of the whole idea? They're trying to trap Jesus. That's what the whole story is all about. "And when they had come, they said to him, 'Teacher, we know that you are true and care about no one, for you do not regard the person of men, but teach the way of God in truth.'" What a lie. Anyway, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Shall we pay or shall we not pay?" Going on, "But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, 'Why do you test me? Bring me a denarius, that I may see it.' So they brought it. And he said to them, 'Whose image and inscription is this?' And they said to him, 'Caesar's.' And Jesus answered and said to them, 'Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's.' And they marveled at him." So there's a couple of things that we learn from this story. What are the lessons that we learned from this story? Go ahead, John. That's a good question. "With God we trust" is on our dollar bill, and our coins, yeah. But it also has on our coins the face of our presidents too, right? So our Caesar is on our coins as well, so to speak. Any other thoughts on that? Go ahead, Shante. So to repeat what Shantae's saying for our online viewing audience, she said these people were in their trappings, were trying to find a way for Jesus to tell them that their religion can give them permission not to pay taxes or whatnot. And that's not the purpose of religion. Religion is not there to help us get out of our duty to society. Was there any other thoughts on this? What else can we learn from the story? Well, I think keep the boundaries strong, yeah. I think really the first thing that we can learn is that the issues of church and state can be tricky. I mean, they took an issue of church and state for the purpose of tricking Jesus. That was their whole purpose. And it was a church-state issue. And so, a lot of times things are not perfectly black and white. And let's not pretend like every issue, like we just know exactly what should be done. Because it's complex. It is complex. And we don't even all agree on what the definition of church and state is, or how things can be merged, or whatnot, or how they overlap. They are two things that are involved in our life, and there's a lot of people who say things like, we can talk about anything except for religion and politics, right? And now we're talking about both in the same breath, right? And so it's inevitably something that is and will be controversial. And let's not pretend like we just know every answer. But the second thing that we really should be able to gather from this conversation between Jesus and the Pharisees and the Herodians is that we do need to keep that separation between church and state. That Jesus is trying to teach us, hey, there is a healthy amount of separation that should be kept between them. Let them each be within their own sphere. Well, let's go on to question 3, shall we? Question 3 says, when would it be appropriate, if there is a time that is appropriate for church and state to rub shoulders, when would that be appropriate? Let's read a couple more verses here. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. This is a verse that we read before, but we're kind of repeating it. It says, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists the ordinance of who? God. And those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices. Notice the wording here is quite interesting. He is using words like minister and God's appointed agency, etc., in reference to political entities, okay? He's not saying these are people who God has nothing to do with, but we have to listen to them anyway. He's saying that they are appointed by God and that they're ministers, etc. The wording is very interesting. Therefore, you must be subject not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, custom to whom customs are due, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. So, when is it appropriate to involve the state in church disputes? Okay, Chris? Okay, so you're questioning the commandment that says thou shalt not kill? Okay, so if the state tells you to do something that's against God's will, then what should we do? Okay, obey God. So what you're saying is, so you're answering something very pointed, and your comment is good. But the question is when is it appropriate to involve the state, or when is it acceptable for the judgment of the state or government authorities or anything to be involved in church experience? Okay, when the church is going against God's will. Now that's a really interesting point. So let me draw this out a little bit further, John. So if I decide that Harvest Christian Fellowship is teaching something against God's will, should I sue them? Should I take them to, and by the way, I don't have a problem with Harvest Christian Fellowship if you go to church there. I'm just using them as an example so everybody knows. If I decide that Harvest Christian Fellowship is teaching apostate doctrines, they are not doing God's will, how is it appropriate to go to the state now and to, no. Because that's their conscience, that's the way they interpret the Bible, and I shouldn't. But any other thoughts? I think you had a thought, Kenneth. Okay. Good. Yeah, that's very similar to what we were talking about yesterday as well. Kenneth said that if the stated law is in agreement with the teachings of the Bible, then by all means we need to go along with it. But it's when there's a variance that we don't. Shante. Okay. Yes. So I tend to totally agree with you. To repeat what Shante said, is that if there is an issue where somebody has violated somebody else and it's against state law, is it not appropriate to allow it to be handled in the courts? Now, going back to that previous verse that we read, though, that Paul said, don't go to the law for everything. That's kind of a gray area, though, right? There are certain scenarios where Paul is judging us and saying, why are you going to the law for everything? But then there's other scenarios where, like, there's actual, legal penalties that people, okay, to put it in different words, the way that the answer is written here I think is very interesting. It says, if crimes have been committed, then the church shouldn't cover them up, so to speak, just because we think, we're going to try to resolve the problem on our own. But if a crime has been committed that has a real serious penalty, we ought to let the state fulfill their charges against the individual if that individual should be punished. We shouldn't be like, oh no, we're going to resolve it on our own. If there's a legal punishment for that purpose, for that person, then we need to make sure that justice is served. Good. Let's go on to question 4. So after Constantine, there was this tragic move toward using power of the state to enforce religious opinions. So this Roman style of coercion that they said, whatever we decide, you better toe the line or else, suddenly came into the church. And Constantine was one of the first ones that started this. That's why we're studying Constantine, because I don't know how, if you're familiar with the church history much, but it didn't start and end with Constantine. This went on for centuries. That the church decided, and I meet many people that say, you know what, I'm not a religious person, I'm a spiritual person. And you know why? Because too much blood has been had in the name of religion. And there is some truth to that. There is quite a bit of truth to that. And I'm a little bit embarrassed by it, that what atrocities have been done in the name of Christ. Because a lot of people from Constantine's time for another, 1,200 plus years decided that whatever we believe, this is what we believe, and you better believe that way or we're going to torture you, we're going to kill you. I mean, you think of the Crusades. stuff like that. And all of this thought pattern started with Constantine. We're going to make Christianity the state religion. And now that it's the state religion, we get to enforce it because it's the state religion. But the question here is, the Bible anticipates the 10 years of the Diocletian persecution. Did it also anticipate the problems that would arise in Christianity itself? So turning to Matthew, we're reading a verse that's familiar because we read it already once, but it's talking, now remember, this is not just a verse where it's in Matthew 24, the apocalypse of Matthew, and he's referring to what things will occur in the church and even in our days. It says, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake, and then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will arise and deceive many, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold." In this passage, what are the warnings that are given that Jesus predicted was going to happen when we go to this type of philosophy of dealing with church issues? What warnings did he give? Chris? Love will grow cold. Yeah. Isn't that the result when religion is enforced? By the way, sorry? Yeah, I was talking about people turning against one another. I went to a Christian college. And in my freshman year of college, I had to do a class on communication, and we all had to give speeches. And one of the speeches that we had to do was a persuasive speech. And in my college class, I don't even know where I stand on the issue. I'm just telling you a story, okay? So don't hold me to my position in my freshman year of college, one way or the other. But in my freshman year of college, I was bothered by the fact that they took attendance at church and during worships, and it was part of our criteria that you had to go to X amount of religious meetings to be a student in good standing. And so part of my persuasive speech was stop making people do it and let them do religion from in their heart, and it will be more pure religion. Well, I got a standing ovation from my class, but my teacher gave me a D. And anyway, I'm not sure where I stand on the issue anymore, but I'm not trying to make an argument for or against taking attendance at our Christian colleges. But my point is this, when religion becomes enforced, it can't be from the heart. I mean, who's going to be, it basically removes the ability to do it from the heart if it's now law. What else is the consequence of that Jesus talked about of this type of thing? Yeah, Shantae? Yeah, very good point. Gary? Okay. Right. Selfishness arises. Good point. So the points listed here in the lesson, the answers are people will turn on one another, as you mentioned. It also said in that same text that false prophets and bad religion would show up. Suddenly, when it's a state religion and it's kind of like this is what's being said, and it's no longer what God says. It's just kind of like whatever, whatever goes, and whatever you can convince to be enforced is now good. So it's just religion becomes totally distorted, and it says the hearts will grow cold, as we mentioned. Let's dig a little bit deeper, though, into this topic and turn with me to Acts chapter 20. So Acts chapter 20, verses 29 and 30 says, "For I know this, that after my departure," this is talking Jesus talking to his disciples, okay? I know this, that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Also from among yourselves men will rise up, speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after themselves. What else is predicted here? What else is predicted? Infighting. Okay, yeah, infighting. Yes, Phyllis? Okay, talking about people getting discouraged and leaving. Okay. Okay, people forming their own churches, right? Yeah, so Paul here is predicting this idea of savage wolves, though, also. This idea of savage wolves. And what do wolves do in folds of sheep? They come in to devour. But they are, as is said, wolves in sheep's clothing, right? They come in. Okay, a lot of hands up here. Okay, let's go. Victoria hasn't talked yet. Go ahead, Victoria. Twisting the truth. Right? They're teaching perverse things, so they're twisting the truth. Exactly. Yes, Jim? Hmm. Okay, so Jim said that when wolves come into a fold of sheep, they don't just kill one, they kill a bunch, and then they just eat one. So we're talking about a huge slaughter, a huge disruption in the church if savage wolves are coming in. Yeah, so I think the way that savage wolves come in into our world today is they're people who, by all ways of observation, they look solid. They look like a good person. They find themselves into a teaching position. And then when they're in a teaching position, they also find some other interesting doctrine, and they just kind of go off and they start twisting things that's not truthful, and they start presenting that. And I think that the way that the sheep are destroyed by the wolves is through false doctrines, oftentimes. So that means we need to be so very careful if even our own teachers, wherever we attend, may unknowingly to us or even to themselves be a savage wolf because they're teaching false doctrine. How important is it that each of us study the Word of God for ourselves? So another passage here, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, and brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. From such turn away. What is Jesus warning about here? It almost reads like a newspaper is what you're saying. It's everything he's warning about, but these are things that are not uncommon in our day and age. These are things that we see, in our world and even in the church, unfortunately. The part that caught my eye most was you see this list of all these really terrible things, and you're like, oh yeah, those worldlings are bad people. And then you look at the very end, and it says, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness. So these people are not worldlings. They're people that claim to be followers of Christ. They claim to be lovers of Christ. They're at church, etc. And they're the ones that have this list of characteristics. And so he's saying, at the end of time, even the followers of God will be so similar to the world, you won't be able to decipher who's the true Christian, who's the worldling. And that's part of the destruction of the last days. Yes, Marie? Yeah. Marie said it's so important to spend your time with God and have a time with Him and get to know Him and let Him work on each of our own hearts individually. Thank you, Marie. Yeah, so Paul here is warning about how Christianity would forget the first principles that it came up with, and they'll come up with a form of godliness, and they'll live like the world. Going on to another verse here, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, "For I am jealous for you with godly jealousy, for I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. But I fear lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ." What is this last prediction about? What is the last warning? I heard you say it, Kenneth. Say it louder. Deception. Deception. So people who have well-meaning hearts, like Eve in the Garden of Eden, didn't have any sin in her heart yet, went to the tree and was deceived. Was deceived. Yeah. So here the church, in this context, he's talking about the bride of Christ, and that's the church. And Paul is fearful that the bride, like the Old Testament Israel, would become unfaithful. So let's go on to question 5. It says, so question 5, even though, to do a little bit of background before I ask the question, even though Christians occasionally suffer from things like ridicule and rejection and even persecution, even though we are going to eventually face some form of tribulation in this life if we live long enough, the same kind of tribulation was faced in the early Christians under this Roman Empire. So in question 5, we eventually come to a remarkable conclusion when we're finally safe in the ultimate kingdom of God. What is that conclusion? Let's read these beautiful promises that we read, yes, in the last night's meeting. "Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no more sea. And then I, John, saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, 'Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be with them, and he will be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying, and there shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away.' Then he who sat on the throne said, 'Behold, I make all things new.' And he said to me, 'Write, for these words are true and faithful.'" So in spite of the coming persecution, and the past persecution, and at times even the just daily trials that we go through, what's the conclusion of the matter? What's the end of the story? That's right. All that stuff is going to go away. We won't have to worry about the past and the problems. You know what? God is ultimately going to wipe away all the tears. He's going to put an end to all suffering. At this moment, the kingdoms of human beings come to an end, and the kingdom of Christ comes to its eternal reality. I'm so thankful for that, aren't you? That we don't have to be terrified about persecution or things to come, because we can rest assured that the end of the story is God's going to make it all right. Well, that really brings us to, unfortunately, the end of our series in Shadow Empire and the study of the life of Constantine. But in reality, we've just barely scratched the surface of religious liberty. We've just kind of opened the cover, and there's so much more to learn about the prophecies of more details about what's going to happen at the end of time, and the rise and power of this one world government that's going to happen at the end of time. And there's so much more to be learned from the book of Daniel and Revelation. And I've already had so many good questions and thoughts being presented to me. So here's the problem. this is coming to an end, but don't worry. We need to keep studying. We need to keep studying. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite you to continue studying with us. I think the best way of going about that is just continuing to study. And why don't we continue to meet on a regular weekly basis? What we'll do is we'll start a class here on Saturday mornings at 10 a.m. and we'll continue a series called Revelation Speaks Peace. And we're going to continue to study the themes and the ideas. One of the first studies we're going to study is on the topic of Daniel chapter 2, and we're going to realize that God had predicted in advance all of the world-ruling empires of the history, and he has predicted 2,500 years ago what would happen. In fact, there are many anti-Christian scholars who are saying Daniel could not have been written in the 6th century BC. It had to have been written in the 2nd century because there's no way he could have predicted all that stuff because God doesn't real and he doesn't exist and prophecy doesn't happen. But the fact is, he did predict all of that, and we're going to study all the stuff that he predicted and see how true it is, even down to our day. So join us next week right here at the Seventh-day Adventist Church at 10 a.m., and we'll continue to study together.